Hello again. This is episode 4, and I welcome you to the series on the Gematria of Genesis. In this section, we're going to be looking at the Garden of Eden and its relationship both to the snake and to the Messiah, and also to Satan. So you can see this is quite a important aspect of the second story of creation. As we've seen in the previous sessions, that we don't only look at the summation of the values or grammatical values of the letters in a word, such as Adam, for example. We notice that summation adds up to 45, but its sequence is Aleph, Dalet, Mem, which is 1, 4, 40. And that implies 1, which is God, 4, the material or physical form of man, and 40, the consciousness of man. And the other thing we saw was the ratios, the impact of ratios, where if we looked at the summation of the tree of life, which came out to 233, and the summation for the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which was 932, that in fact had an exact ratio of 1:4, which has implications in terms of the world of oneness, or the world of God, and the physical world. So now let's look at this next aspect, where we'll be looking at the Garden of Eden, which, as you'll see here, the value for the Garden of Eden is Gan Eden in Hebrew, 179. And the value for the word for Messiah, which is Mashiach in Hebrew, is 358. Again, we see that 179 over 358 has a ratio of 1:2. So this implies that there's a direct relationship between the Garden of Eden and the Messiah. And we can see that later on in these discussions, that it does actually relate to Mount Moriah, or Temple Mount in Jerusalem, being the Garden of Eden and the place where the Messiah will appear. So this is a very important link between the Garden of Eden and Messiah, and also the city of Jerusalem, Temple Mount, and the Messiah. Let's go one step further. So, okay, these numbers are 179, 358, but the interesting aspect is that 358 is also the same value as snake, which is Nachash in Hebrew, which appears in the Garden of Eden, which tempts Eve into taking the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and giving it to Adam. So why should snake and Messiah have the same values? And this brings us into another concept in Gematria, and that is the world of opposites, that you can have a value which is exactly the same, but has complete opposite intentions. And here we see Messiah being the highest form of man, and the snake being the lowest form. He's told that he will crawl on his belly for the rest of his life, that he's considered the lowest of the low. And we see this world of opposites appearing significantly in Gematria. To give the example that the word for holy, which is kadush in Hebrew, and yet this is the highest spiritual format related to God. And yet the word for a prostitute in Hebrew is kedusha, which is the lowest form, the outcast. We see a similar aspect in terms of, we know that 400 is the highest spiritual level that man can reach on this earthly plane. And yet, if you take the word Metzora, which means leper, the outcast, he's pushed out of society, he's pushed away, he also has a value of 400. So the world of opposites is very implicit in Gematria. We see this later on in several examples. Let's look one step further on this. And if we look at the word for Satan, it's 359. So Messiah is 358 and Satan is 359. Just that one difference. What is that one difference? How does that one difference switch from Messiah, the highest form of spirituality on this earth, and Satan, which is accountable with the devil? And I think the best analogy we can attribute to this is when a person is climbing up a mountain, he reaches the peak, and that whole effort of reaching this highest plane, this highest level of spirituality, and yet once you get to the top of the mountain, just one slip, one fatal mistake, and as you see from this diagram, man falls down and crashes to the floor. And there are multiple examples of this in the case of wine, which actually has a geometrical value of 70, which rises up to a level of spiritual consciousness. And yet, if you have too much, it flips you down into a state of desecration. So these are some of the examples that we see in the Garden of Eden, the relationship between the Messiah, the Garden of Eden, between the Messiah, the higher form, the snake as a lower form, and then the ease in which man can fall into the lowest state possible. Okay, we'll move on to session 5 and examine more in some of these aspects.